You don't just show up at the monastery and become an oblate. You do show up at the monastery, you inquire of the oblate director at the monastery, and at least that's the way it worked in my case. Father Thomas O'Connor, of pleasant memory, very, very pleasant memory, was the oblate director, and he was already, Father O'Connor was already quite aged, and the times that I was privileged to be able to sit with Father O'Connor, to go into the refectory, for those of you unfamiliar with that kind of terminology, refectory, to go into the dining hall and sit with Father O'Connor at times during the day when really the letter of the rule says, you know, you're not supposed to be in there snacking, but Father O'Connor would slip in there and make him a little cup of tea and sip that cup of tea, or find him a cookie. I think he had some health issues going on that required him to get a little nibble of something every now and then. But a beautiful, beautiful, precious man. And Father O'Connor welcomed me as an inquirer and tutored me, received me as such, and accepted me into the novitiate, a year-long discernment process of determining whether this is something that I wanted to make a lifelong promise to, a sacred promise. And a year later was the ceremony where in the side chapel at the St. Bernard Abbey, the side chapel on the altar is where I signed my oblate promise. And the oblate promise, or promises, are the same as, essentially the same as the vows that the brothers and sisters that live in the monasteries, in separate monasteries, it's not a co-ed thing, but the same, the promises that oblates make are the same as the vows, that the same principles as the vows that the brothers and the sisters living in the monasteries make. And those have to do with obedience. We promise obedience, we promise stability, we promise conversatio morum, conversion of life. Obedience, stability, and conversatio morum. The third of those is commonly interpreted or translated conversion of life. And Benedict was never content that anyone enter his monastery as a brother, enter into his school as a student. He was not content with them staying as they were, and the challenge was always to be growing deeper and deeper, not only in our knowledge, our head knowledge of Christ, but that our hearts be continually converted, because the more our hearts are converted, the more able we are, the more capable we are of receiving more of Christ in us. And that's a very important thing, and I think it's something that's terribly neglected in church teaching today, whether it's in a Protestant church or whether it's in the Catholic Church. And I think Benedict makes that case very plainly, very clearly, that we need to be constantly growing deeper, being more and more converted to the gospel of Jesus Christ, so that we can be not just talking about the gospel, not only recommending the gospel to other people, but more to the point, experiencing the gospel in our lives and being changed, being converted, and in so doing become more and more like Christ walking on the face of this earth. Father Timothy Fry wrote the preface to what we refer to as the RB 1980. Liturgical Press holds the copyright to the RB 1980, and I do a lot of blogging, and I have a blog. I have several blogs. One in particular is Oblate Reflections, where I talk about Oblate life. I talk about Catholic life, my Oblate life, my Catholic life, and there's quite a number of little articles that have begun to stack up there, and it's kind of a repository, a place to chronicle and catalog my continuing journey, and I'll give you the link to that if you want to jump over there and read some of that. But I contacted Liturgical Press about using the go on, Bub. about using the RB 1980 in my blogs, and they had a problem with that. So when you read my stuff at the blog, it's it's an older open source translation of the Rule of Saint Benedict, and Father Fry, he gives us a little bit in his preface. He tells us just a little bit about Saint Benedict, and Saint Benedict lived in the 6th century in Italy, and during that particular time frame the Roman Empire was collapsing, and there was a lot of chaos. There was a lot of social chaos. Not only social chaos, but a lot of moral chaos that was affecting the known world at that time, and a lot of barbaric activity. Saint Benedict, as a young man, left his home, his native Nursia in Umbria, and he went to Rome to attend school there. He became disgusted with the paganism that he saw around him. Paganism not only in the world, but the way paganism had begun to infiltrate the church. And rather, in Benedict's day, I see so many parallels between Benedict's time and the time that we live in today. The church has always been a counter-cultural movement. Get that? The church has always been a counter-cultural movement. That's the way Christ designed the church. But what we see over the course of history, and particularly now in the late 20th, or say mid 20th till now in the 21st century, rather than the church being the countercultural movement that it is intended by Christ to be, the church has begun to buy into the pagan elements of the world, and has begun to allow the pagan elements in the world to dictate to the church in areas that are reserved for the church to insist as being, this is the way, walk ye in it. Faith and morals. The world outside the church has no place dictating to the church what is moral or what is appropriate in regard to a spiritual belief system.